Well, I forgot about that. I've done enough of these. I should have known that that was the start. But so as you just heard, we are recording. Welcome everybody. My name is James Egan. I'm a member of the executive committee of the Mormon Scholars in the Humanities Organization that's hosting this event. And it's my job here to inform you just real briefly about what we are and what we're doing here tonight. So MSH, as we call it, is a forum for convening scholars and producing scholarship that's interested in the interplay between Mormonism and the history of human thought and expression, the humanities. And it's, our focus is on creating a forum for generous exploration and disciplined curiosity with a Mormon inflection, is the way I'd put it. And we're glad to be doing some of that tonight on a big, broad question about justice. I'm really looking forward to our participants tonight and hearing what they have to say. But I will get out of the way and let Katie, who is our moderator tonight, give us an introduction to the topic and to our participants. I'm just realizing I should have pulled up Katie's bio, but she's an assistant professor of philosophy, right, Katie, at Brigham Young University. And as I was just getting to know her earlier today, she's a philosopher in the style of David Hume, or at least partly in the tradition. And we're grateful to have her moderating. So take it away, Katie.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here, even though, as mentioned, I study David Hume, who was a skeptic about both religion and the existence of things like justice. So, so I'm a great person to be in a position where I'm prompting others to say the things they know and they're thinking, because I'm inclined to ask a lot of questions about it. I'm excited to be here, and I'm excited to hear what people have to say about justice. As I was thinking about and preparing to moderate, which might be a really minimal role, this might be the only time you hear from me tonight, but I was thinking about the nature of justice and doing a little reading and reminding myself. And justice is one of those concepts that shows up in a lot of discourses, very connected, but there's a lot of different ways the term is used, different understandings. Sometimes we're talking about something that exists external to human and human conventions. Sometimes we're talking about something that is applied in the context of human law or other forms of law. As I thought about the theological context that we're talking about tonight, my attention was actually drawn to Alma, a discussion in Alma, as well as the, what would this be? The gospel topics description of justice, where it makes it really clear that justice is characterized as some sort of unchanging law that concerns consequences to action. So what is done has consequences, and that is the demands of justice. And in fact, a lot of the time, justice seems to be introduced in the scriptures in a context where we're motivating the need for a savior and the need for atonement, because it turns out we all take a lot of actions that are going to, according to the laws of justice, have consequences we don't want, including things like spiritual death. So I am going to stop saying anything about justice now. As I look at the people we have, I think we're going to have a really nice array of perspectives and views on the nature of justice. And so I'm excited to invite them to start speaking. So allow me to I'm going to introduce our speakers in the order that they'll be presenting. So first, we're going to hear from Cherise Bacalski. She's an appellate attorney who works primarily with indigent defendants in both Utah and California. Before attending law school at BYU Law, she received her undergrad in rhetoric and writing from CSU San Marcos, and an MFA in creative writing and an MA in rhetoric from BYU. And apparently she is considering an advanced degree at the U in anything, because in her words, to even things out. After law school, she was an appellate prosecutor for a year before clerking at the Utah Court of Appeals and then at the Utah Supreme Court for Justice John Pierce. At BYU Law, She teaches moot court and appellate writing clinic. So we're excited to hear from you, Cherise. Nate Oman is our next presenter. He's the Rollins Professor at William and Mary Law School. He was educated at Brigham Young University and Harvard Law School. In addition to William and Mary, he has been a visiting professor at the University of Richmond, Cornell Law School, and Hebrew University. His research focused on private law theory and Mormon legal history. He is currently working on a book examining the Latter-day Saint legal tradition, and apparently he enjoys fly fishing and playing the banjo, claims to do neither of these things well. I'd be interested to see evidence one way or the other at some point. Next, we will have Ryan Davis, who is an assistant professor of political science at BYU. Ryan writes about the value of autonomy in ethics, politics, and religion. He's currently interested in the grounds of moral requirements, the ethics of belief, and intertextual connections within the work of, wait for it, Taylor Swift. I so hope that comes up somehow today, and the relationship between practical and epistemic norms. Importantly, once he won third prize in the Provo Pioneer Day pie baking contest for his entry, Pecans Not Quite Without Number. That sounds wonderful. Another thing I'd like to see evidence of at some point. Our final speaker today is Derek Haderlie. He is an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy at BYU, making him my colleague. Lucky me, very much so. He teaches philosophy of religion, philosophy of science, metaphysics, logic, and ethics. I know what you're thinking, leave something for the rest of us, but it's fine. I like that he does that. He has published papers on topics in the philosophy of religion, including the nature of faith and the afterlife, according to Mormon theology. He also does research on the metaphysics of morality and in particular on the nature of moral laws. He obtained a PhD in philosophy at the University of Texas at Austin. So we will ask that the four of you, in the order that have just been presented, start off by just giving us about 8 minutes, because it'll be easy to do it in 8 minutes, in answer to the question, what is Mormon justice? And we will see where this discussion takes us. Thank you. Cherise, please. I think she might need to be unmuted.
Okay,
Jonah.
Am I unmuted? Yeah. All right. So my invitation here was a surprise, and I'm really excited about it. Humanities was my first love, and my turn into the law was actually also a surprise for me. And so I'm excited to be able to converse with people who are interested in the humanities. I have to say, though, I think that of all of the careers that you can pick in the law, mine is probably the most focused on things of a human nature. I am an indigent criminal defense attorney, and I work at the appellate level. All of my clients are in prison or on parole. They have all been found guilty. And so I work really intimately with the justice system, the American justice system, of course. There are so many different justice systems all over the world that we can talk about. But so I spend my days reviewing trials. So I get really kind of heavy into what our justice system does on a very practical level. And I also think very heavily about what the rules mean, what they should be doing, as opposed to what they are doing. And I try to help present that to courts who review the petitions and briefs that I file on behalf of my clients. So that's a little bit about my practice and why I'm here today. What I'd like to do is compare a Mormon concept of a justice system to our justice system, or the justice system that I'm working within. And I have to start out at the outset saying I have no answers. And I have no answers because I think that this is something that you can study for a lifetime and find little nuggets here and there in order to piece together a concept of an eternal justice system. And what I'm thinking is that at the end, I mean, I guess with any kind of scientific question that you ask, you kind of like posit a question. Is it a justice system or is it more of a mercy system? I think is my question going into this study. And this is probably something that I'll pick up and try to study for a while since the question has been posed to me. In our justice system, we have a judge. We kind of picture the judge sitting up at the top, very austere looking, making legal determinations and meting out judgment. And we've got the prosecutor, we've got the defense attorney, we've got the defendant, we've got the victim, we've got a jury, we've got the police who are usually coupled with the detectives who are working with the prosecution. We've got experts on both sides that weigh in. So we've got experts for the prosecution, and really I'm just focusing on criminal law here. I'm not thinking about civil law. So when I say prosecutor, that's, prosecutor, and defense attorney, that's why. So experts on both sides. And as I began thinking about what an eternal justice system looked like, it occurred to me that a lot of those roles kind of might fade away. I actually have not been to an eternal justice court. And so I have no idea, aside from some very basic ideas, what that might look like. I think that it might look like the judge, right? Sitting in the chair, maybe not sitting in a chair. It could be a round table. It could be kind of like an Arthurian round table where everyone's sitting around collaborating. I don't know. But we've got somebody who ultimately will mete out judgment. And I think that we are familiar with the concept of God the Father playing that role. In as much as a lot of academic work is definitional, I have to just say from the outset that when the word God is used, I envision a man and a woman working together, united together. And so I don't see God in that role as being just a man. It could be that there is a woman combined with him in that role, meting out judgment, but also meting out mercy. So these are just some of the questions that I'm throwing out there. I think that it's likely, we've heard that Christ is our advocate with the Father. So likely that Christ is there playing the role of criminal defense attorney. And that's my favorite, especially when my Mormon friends ask me like, oh my gosh, how can you do what you do? You're representing bad guys. And I think clearly they don't understand what I do, but I love telling people that in the great metaphor of life, I am Jesus. So that's the role that I play as a criminal defense attorney. And that always makes them uncomfortable. So God, possibly Heavenly Mother, whether or not there are multiple Heavenly Mothers in a Mormon theological system, could be populated by many Heavenly Mothers. I don't know. Christ, the individual, likely there. Now, I've come across things in my studies that have suggested that maybe some past prophets in various dispensations will be there. I have no idea what role they would play, but I think it's really interesting to kind of whittle down all of the roles, the prosecutor, and all of the resources behind the prosecutor, and think, okay, we've got the finder of fact, who is going to be an omniscient being, who's, God the Father, maybe Heavenly Mother, these people who are going to be who know everything already. They don't need a prosecutor to introduce evidence to them. They've got the evidence in front of them, right? And it's really interesting because there's this really cool crossover. If you think about Christ's role as a defense attorney, his role is really expanded or limited by our individual use of the atonement. And so we then become part of the evidentiary gathering body, in as much as we apply the atonement to our lives and allow Christ to advocate for us, right? And so his role is as expansive or as limited as we allow it to be. And the evidence that's placed before the ultimate fact finder is also as limited or as expansive as we allow it to be through our engagement in the atonement. So those are just some of the thoughts that I want to throw out there. Those are kind of my theories about how we participate as defendants in the eternal justice system, which might be better termed a mercy system, because it seems like the resources that the heavens are interested in are differently disposed of than the resources that we are here, that we're engaged in here on earth. We've got these prosecutors' offices with enormous resources and very limited public defense resources. But if you look at in the eternal scheme of things within a Mormon doctrine kind of picture, what you see is all of the resources being poured into Christ, right? Like all we do is talk of Christ. The point of the temple, everything points to Christ. Christ is everything, and he is our advocate with divinity, with the judge. And so I think that it's an interesting swap there, where there might be a greater focus on mercy than on justice. Now, I haven't even attempted to find mercy and justice. I think we each bring, it's just too much work to do in 8 minutes. But I think I'm done. I think it's an interesting thing to think about. And I have, like I said, not really any answers. I'm just kind of throwing out questions. In light of our own justice system, what might an eternal justice system look like? And what does that then say about the priorities of I guess the heavens? Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Cherise. Nate, can you follow up on that?
Sure. So I'm going to talk about justice in a slightly different way. So first, I'm not going to talk about cosmic justice or anything like that. I'm just going to talk about the justice of ordinary human institutions, like the justice of a legal system. And then the second thing I want to talk about is the idea that we have an obligation to obey the law. And what is the relationship between the justice of legal institutions and the obligation to obey legal institutions within Mormon thought? Now, Mormon thought's kind of diffuse, right? We have this historical tradition. We've got scripture that basically consists of lots of different stories and some declarative sentences. So there's nothing, right, really as exalted or clearly worked out as like a Mormon philosophy of the obligation to obey the law. There are, however, Mormon arguments that show up again and again and again about why we should obey the law. That is, reasons get offered. And there's a long tradition of theological reflection on the obligation to obey the law. So a lot of theologians just come to the conclusion, right, that there isn't any particular obligation to obey the law at all, that human laws are depraved. So Augustine comes very close to this in the City of God. The traditional Catholic position on the obligation to obey the law goes something like this, is that one has an obligation to obey the law when human law corresponds with natural law. So that is to say is that our obligation to obey the law is contingent on the justice of the law. So we look to the substantive content of the law to determine whether or not we've got an obligation to obey it. That's a massive oversimplification. That's sort of the gist of it. There are also various voluntarist theories. So a voluntarist theory is an argument about the obligation to obey the law where one has an obligation to obey the law because one has in some sense consented to it, right? So the most famous examples of these would be theories like Hobbesian or Lockean social contract theories. And we can get sort of fancy versions of those with bells and whistles in something like John Rawls. Those also have theological precursors and analogs. The Reformed tradition offers something like a voluntarist obligation to obey the law. There are also what are called expressive theories of legal obligation. And in fact, the earliest philosophical discussion of the obligation to obey the law comes in the Platonic dialogue of the Crito, in which Socrates asserts that he has an obligation to obey an unjust law, his own unjust sentence of death. And he has the obligation to comply with the Athenian law. Why? Because he owes a debt of gratitude to Athens. He has an obligation to express his gratitude. And the way in which he discharges that expressive obligation to show gratitude towards the law is by rendering obedience to its commands. So the idea would be is that we have some moral reason, normative reason, to express a particular attitude about the law, and that obedience is a way in which we express discharge that particular expressive obligation. So what's interesting is that within Mormonism, there is a strong strain of an expressive obligation to obey the law, which I haven't seen in other theological traditions. I don't want to make some strong claim about uniqueness. I just haven't seen it. So here's how the argument goes something like this. For a variety of reasons, Mormons have long been subject to high levels of political and civic suspicion. This has been the case since the time of Joseph Smith to the present. There are various reasons for that. Part of it has to do with the sort of inherent risk of antinomianism that's present in claims to continuing revelation. So there's always this sort of concern, right, that the Mormons are going to do crazy things because God says something to their prophet. And like, look, you look at Mormon history and it's not a totally crazy concern because Mormons have in fact done some sort of social norm violating kinds of behavior because of divine prophetic commands, including norm violating behavior that breaks the law. And so there's suspicion towards Mormons. Now, there was a time when most Mormons lived in some sort of Deseret-like Mormon community in which Mormons sort of ran the community and called the shots. Most Mormons don't live in that world. Most Mormons are a tiny minority in a non-Mormon society. And oftentimes they are the object of political and legal suspicion. So what the church consistently has taught, particularly since 1945, is it's taught that Latter-day Saints have an obligation to obey the law in order to show that they are good citizens. And the reason that they need to show that they are good citizens is because the church needs to be able to carry out its program, to build Zion, to proclaim the gospel. And it's difficult for them to do that in the face of legal opposition. So in order to lay to rest concerns about Mormon antinomianism, Mormons are told that they have this obligation to be good citizens, to express themselves as good citizens. And that obligation is manifested in an obligation to obey the law. And you can find variations on something like this in lots of Mormon statements, general conference talks, and the like, right? And usually something like the 12th Article of Faith gets dragooned in as a textual or scriptural support, or section 134 of the Doctrine and Covenants. So there's some interesting characteristics about this argument. So the first is that it seems to me that it responds to a pretty well-worn objection to expressive theories of law. And that is that if we have an obligation to express a particular attitude toward the law, why does that expressive obligation have to be discharged through obedience? So if Socrates owes a debt of gratitude to the laws of Athens, and he morally ought to express his gratitude towards them, why does he have to express his gratitude by drinking hemlock and complying with the law? Why can't he express his gratitude by like writing a poem in praise of Athens or something like that? So the Mormon argument, because the expressive obligation is a response to fears of Mormon antinomianism, Mormon obedience to the law is a particularly apt way of responding to that concern. So Mormons could say something like, we're good citizens, you don't need to worry about us, right? And then the question is, well, how do we know that the Mormons are being honest about being good citizens and not being a threat to the law? So long as Mormons are obeying the law, that is the most powerful way that they can express that they are not going to be a threat civically to the law. So it is a expressive argument that seems to respond, or at least have a kind of response to this well-known objection to expressive arguments. The second thing about it is that it has a very odd feature. And that is because the obligation to obey the law is a response to potential legal hostility toward the church, it would seem that the more hostile and aggressive the legal regime is towards the church, the greater is one's obligation to obey the law of that legal regime. So actually, in this expressive argument, there's an inverse relationship between the justice of the legal regime and the strength of one's expressive obligations to obey the legal regime. And this, I think, has created some of the more interesting and difficult to resolve tensions in the Mormon experience. So the most dramatic example of this is Helmut Humener, who was executed by the Gestapo during World War II for violating Nazi laws by distributing anti-Nazi leaflets. So it's Nazism, right, is the quintessential example of an unjust legal system. Nobody wants to say that you've got an obligation to obey Nazi law. And generally speaking, we would think of Huber as a moral hero, right? Or at least we would certainly understand his moral disgust at the Nazi regime. Humener was excommunicated. Now, in part, he was excommunicated from the church because his branch president was a Nazi, literally a Nazi. He was one of a few Latter-day Saints who was a member of the Nazi party. He was excommunicated because the Gestapo told the church they had to excommunicate him. Okay, but he was also excommunicated because his activities brought the Gestapo down on his local branch, including investigations of his stepfather and others. That was incredibly dangerous for that little religious community. So part of the reason they excommunicated him was to preserve the community from the attacks of the Gestapo. And so it's a terrible and difficult situation. And what's interesting, right, is it is a peculiarly Mormon moral conundrum in the sense that it arises out of this inherent tension in the expressive obligation that Latter-day Saints have to obey the law because of the problematic relationship between justice and legal obligation within that argument. I don't necessarily have a great way of resolving any of those questions, and I don't want to claim that this is the only way in which one could think about justice, certainly, or even about the obligation to obey the law within Latter-day Saint theology. But it is, I think, a salient part of our tradition. And it's one that is, I think, particularly sort of philosophically or theoretically interesting when you look at it against the background of the sort of long history of philosophical and theological reflection on legal obligation.
Thank you very much, Nate. Wonderful. Okay, Ryan, can you please add to our idea of Mormon justice here?
All right. Well, thanks so much for having me. And I am a slides person, and I've been on Zoom for long enough now that my primary mode of human communication is sharing slides. So if you'll indulge this, here we go. Here's the big picture. Let me make sure I'm on time. Yeah, good. Question is, what is Mormon justice? I'm going to read that as what can Mormonism, I'm going to use that term since we're using it. What can Mormonism contribute to an understanding of justice? That's how I'm going to hear it. And my answer is going to be that Mormonism says that the domain of justice is smaller than you might have thought. So what does that mean? I think that the importance of that is that limiting justice is going to make it easier to learn about the kingdom of heaven. That's the thing I'm going to argue for. So here's the plan that the next 7 minutes. I'm going to describe the concept of justice. Then I'm going to argue that Mormonism's distinctive contribution to justice is that it's going to disconnect justice from salvation. That's what I'm going to say. Third, I'm going to say that disconnecting justice from salvation explains Mormonism's grand fundamental principle. Finally, I'm going to try and get you to think that reducing the domain of justice is good news. But I realize some people might find that unappealing, so I have a backup plan if you don't like that, which was suggested to me when I posted this on Facebook today by a friend of mine who said that an alternative that I could propose is that Mormon Justice is a fantastic name for a cop show. So that's my backup suggestion about a contribution to Mormon justice. So keep that in mind if you don't like the first proposal. All right, here we go. So justice, I think a conceptual platitude about justice is that it has to do with in principle enforceability. So if things are unjust, it's permissible for other people to interfere to prevent the injustice. And that's not true in other normative domains. So morality, I'm going to say, is that part of normativity that's other people's business. If you do something that's morally wrong, other people can appropriately have attitudes against you about that. So for example, if you break a promise, other people can resent you, they can be indignant. If you break your exercise program, that's not true. If you violate someone's rights, they can interfere with you. If you violate norms of etiquette, doesn't really matter. So the thing that sort of like justifies other people in getting involved is violating moral requirements. So, you know, if they violate your rights, if they paint you out to be bad, then it's okay that you're mad, as Taylor Swift would say. And justice then is that part of morality that can be enforced. That's just what I'm gonna. James says that my greatest skill is making stipulations, so I'm just gonna stipulate that one, and we'll come back around. That, by the way, is my secret of stipulating. Is you just do it and then go on. So far this idea, but I think this is a general idea that morality has to do with what we owe to each other. That was famously suggested by the real life philosophers Tim Scanlon, and much more famously suggested by the TV show. All right. So now the second thing. Where am I at? Got 4 minutes. Great. So here is the argument. I'm going to say that Mormonism separates the norms of the kingdom of heaven from the norms of justice. And if the kingdom of heaven's norms are not the norms of justice, then failing to follow the norms of the kingdom of heaven doesn't warrant moral censure. Detaching the norms of the kingdom of heaven from moral censure facilitates learning from other religious traditions. So doing that, Mormonism's detachment of justice from the kingdom of heaven facilitates that learning from other traditions. That's what I'm going to say. Okay. So first bit, why does Mormonism say this first premise about separating about, that it distinguishes the norms of the kingdom of heaven from the norms of justice? Why does it say that? So here's my case about that. Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon are reading John 5:25, and they reinterpret it. And Joseph Smith renders the verse in Doctrine and Covenants 76 slightly differently. He says that they who have done good in the resurrection of the just will come forth, and then that's distinguished from those who have done evil who will come forth in the resurrection of the unjust. So there's the distinction between just and unjust. What is that distinction? Well, the distinction is in the resurrection of the just are celestial persons and terrestrial persons. Terrestrial persons are honorable people of the earth who have been blinded by the craftiness of men. And then comes the resurrection of the celestial persons. Those are people who really violate other people's rights, who lie and steal and murder and all that business. And they're the people who are condemned, whereas sort of like it's someone else's business. And so here's the idea. That first resurrection then is the resurrection of the just, and it includes the people who are celestial and terrestrial, and then is the resurrection of the unjust. So there are two distinctions, the distinction of the just from the unjust, and the distinction of those who are just and those who are just and perfect through covenant with Christ. So that the idea there is that if you can be just without, is that you can be just without being made perfect through the covenant of Christ. And that means that the norms of the covenant of Christ, the norms of the kingdom of heaven, are not the norms of justice. They're something else. So I'm going to summarize that by saying that the laws of the kingdom of heaven are not the requirements of justice. And so here's then the idea, if you violate justice, then you can be condemned. The alternative is, for the people in the first resurrection, that you're just not willing to receive as much, but that's not an issue of condemnation. And Joseph Smith uses the word honorable that same way. Okay, so here's the conceptual point. Where am I at? Got a couple minutes, good. Violating the norms, violating non-moral norms doesn't undermine relationships with other people. Whereas if you do violate moral norms, it does undermine your relationships with other people. You know, if like some people just doesn't keep etiquette, you might be like, oh, we can still be friends. But if someone violates your rights, you can't be friends with that person. Joseph Smith makes the same point about the nature of friendship. So we can do this exegetically as well. And so now I'm going to suggest that given that distinction that's in the background of the way that Mormonism uses the distinction between just and unjust, we can explain the conclusion that we can learn from others better. That in fact is the fundamental principle of Mormonism, Joseph Smith says. So here's the whirlwind tour of it. Joseph Smith says that the grand fundamental principle of Mormonism is to receive truth, let it come from whence it may, or alternatively to receive it from any other religious tradition, notwithstanding that those traditions have different views about what salvation takes, about the norms of the kingdom of heaven. And similarly, that we should be tolerant of their views. We should, like, instead of criticizing them, find things to take them on. Why is that the fundamental principle? Well, it's the fundamental principle because it explains how you can get to the other principles. So here's the idea. We can get to the other principles in Mormonism. We can sort of explain their grounding or the way that they're acquired by virtue of the fundamental principle that we can learn from other people. Why can you learn from them? Well, we can learn from them because we're not criticizing them, and we're not criticizing them because even though they have different norms about salvation, we don't think of those as relevant to justice. And so you can maintain friendship with those people. So here's the big picture idea, and I am exactly at time, so good. So this is my thesis. I've tried to warn you to. The internal features of Mormonism not only don't condemn other traditions as a matter of justice, but it explains why justice doesn't apply to them. That's what creates the space for learning. So what does Mormonism contribute to an understanding of justice? Well, it contributes the explanatory connection between a limiting justice, saying justice is not about salvation, and learning from others, because then you can disagree about salvation, but still think that you can learn from them, maintain friendship with the grand fundamental principle of taking truth from any of those other things. Otherwise, that might be more difficult. But if you don't like that view, remember, there's still the cop show. And maybe you like that view better. And I even made a slide sort of pitching that idea. There it is, Mormon justice. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ryan. The slideshow is definitely worth it, especially for the last slide. So. All right, great. Well then, Derek is our final person to answer, just kind of give a basic take on the question, what is Mormon justice? Then we're going to allow the speakers to talk to one another and see what we get out of it. So Derek, go ahead.
Okay. Lehi in the Book of Mormon, he teaches his sons, he says, prepare your souls for that glorious day when justice shall be administered. I think this is a pretty striking image, given that the judgment is often spoken of in trembling and fearful tones. And I think the reason that there's so much fear and trembling arising out of the around the judgment is that there's a belief that divine justice is actually unjust. And I think this is largely an inheritance of a confusion over how God thinks about each of us. To illustrate this, when I was a graduate student in Virginia, I would meet every Thursday with a friend of mine who was a pastor in the local Presbyterian church. And during one of our meetings, he gave an analogy to help explain his view of God's divine justice. He said something like this: Arthur and his valiant knights rode over a hill to find a battle underway. It was clear their favored side was beginning to lose. Lancelot, with all his passion, said, "We must go down and assist our friends." Arthur, in his wisdom, replied, "Let us wait a while so the battle may become all the more dire, and so that our intervention will demonstrate all the more our mighty power." So they waited. The battle did turn dire. The men began to retreat before the foe, and then, and only then, Arthur led his knights to turn the battle and defeat the enemy. What lesson do we learn from that? I asked my friend. His response was that God will demonstrate his mighty power over evil by allowing many of his children to fall to evil, so that when God intervenes with those few remaining, it will be clear that God works miraculously in his mercy. The picture seems to be that God allows justice to claim the majority of his children so that his mighty mercy can be manifest. But this seems like a monstrous, unmerciful, and unjust God. But that's the God that Jonathan Edwards, the famous Congregationalist preacher and theologian, described when he says in his famous sermon, "The God that holds you over the pit of hell, much as one holds a spider or some loathsome insect over the fire, abhors you and is dreadfully provoked. His wrath towards you burns like fire. He looks upon you as worthy of nothing else but to be cast into the fire. He is of pure eyes and to bear to have you in his sight. You are 10,000 times so abominable in his eyes as the most hateful venomous serpent is in ours." The thought then, it seems, is that we are deserving of nothing but pain and suffering. And since we're God's creations, then God seems to be a hateful, vengeful, cruel, vindictive, and petty being. But that's the God of Dante's Inferno, who tortures the sinners for eternity in the most horrific of ways. And so on, the confusion of God's justice continues. The central idea is that God's divine justice is utterly alien from anything that we would call just. And so we tremble in fear as we consider what to us can only be called an unjust God. So why is Lehi calling the day of judgment glorious? And why does Abinadi declare that all shall confess before God that his judgments are just? So let me turn to some philosophy for a moment. Here's a little philosophical puzzle that was developed by Ted Sider. He says, premise 1, there are exactly 2 states in the afterlife, heaven and hell. Premise 2 is that people in hell are much worse off than the people in heaven. It's really bad in hell comparatively. The third premise is that heaven and hell are going to have some people in them. So heaven's going to have some people, hell's going to have some people, and God decides who goes where. But importantly, God's judgment is just. And since justice is proportional in the sense that it prohibits very unequal treatment of persons who are very similar in similar respects, it looks like we get a little puzzle, because there are going to be borderline cases. That means there are going to be people that are over here in hell that are really close to having made it into heaven. There are going to be people in heaven over here that are really close to having been condemned to hell. And the problem is, it seems like there will be borderline cases, not just that there could be, but that there will be. So it looks like God actually couldn't be just in his application of putting people into heaven and hell because of these borderline cases. You might think, well, look, we've got this really nice solution to this problem. We've got 3 kingdoms, not 2 places for people to go into, 2 boxes. We've got 3. But that doesn't really actually fix the problem, because even if we take the terrestrial and celestial, the terrestrial is probably, or seemingly unimaginably wonderful, yet it pales in comparison to the greatness of the celestial kingdom. So there's going to be borderline cases that are going to have, very distinct kinds of outcomes. Now, a very quick, small digression. The problem seems to me to be that for those at the borderline, there's a major difference in outcome, while there is only a small difference in the choices that they might have made in their lives. And that looks like it undermines the notion that choices matter, or that there are consequences that are just and proportional to an act. So when Alma is teaching his son Corianton, he tries to clarify this. He says, God would cease to be God if that sort of thing was happening. And this is a distinctively Mormon teaching. For according to this theology, there's a possibility that God would cease to be God if he were to violate justice. I'm going to kind of leave that as an interesting thing to think about. But on this view, justice seems to be partly constituted by proportionality and consequences, where in a kind of classical sense, God must render to each their due. So we might, like Corey Anton, worry in our minds concerning the justice of God and the punishment of the sinner, for we might suppose it's an injustice that the sinner should be consigned to a state of mercy. So let me propose a distinctively Mormon solution very quickly. There are two primary claims to this Mormon style solution that I'm offering. The first is what I'm calling escapism. Escapism is the claim that it has two parts. The first is that the lower kingdoms, the terrestrial and telestial, exist and might be populated for eternity. So that might be that there will be people there forever. The second is that if there are any inhabitants in the lower kingdoms, then at any time, it will be possible for them to accept God's reconciliatory efforts, leave the lower kingdom, and enter into a higher kingdom. But what we need to add to this claim of escapism is a kind of what I'm going to call a preferentialist conception of the afterlife. And that's a conception where we will go where we prefer to be. Now, Joseph Smith had been concerned about his brother's fate, Alvin, who had died before receiving baptism. And since baptism is essential for salvation, so says Jesus, Joseph Smith was worried for his brother. But in an 1836 vision, which we're all familiar with, in section 76, he received this revelation that was so grand and described the kingdom of glory and suggested that all might be saved. And it was so glorious that Joseph Smith said, "Let the dead speak forth anthems of eternal praise to the King Emmanuel." Oh, my time ran out. "To the King Emmanuel, who hath ordained before the world was that which would enable us to redeem them out of their prisons, for the prisoners shall go free." The idea was that baptisms for the dead would provide an avenue for God's mercy to be extended to those who hadn't had an opportunity to make choices that would have consequences, with the consequence being eternal salvation. This is a distinctively Mormon view. But further, Hiram, Joseph's brother, said that those in the middle glory either advance to the high or recede to the low, or else the moon would not be a type because it waxes and wanes. Orson F. Whitney, an early apostle, said that in this life or the life to come, all of God's children will return. James E. Faust said, "I believe and accept that comforting statement" by Orson F. Whitney. Robert D. Hales, Boyd K. Packer, James E. Talmage, many others have said this. James E. Talmage said, "Advancement from grade to grade within any kingdom and from kingdom to kingdom will be provided for. Eternity is progressive." And I'll just conclude with some words from Jesus. He said, "My Father sent me that I might be lifted up upon the cross. And after I had been lifted up upon the cross, that I might draw all men unto me. And for this cause have I been lifted up. Therefore, according to the power of the Father, I will draw all men unto me."
Thank you very much, Derek. Okay, I hope that we've all been impressed by what was anticipated, which is the variety of ways that we can talk about justice here. Just as a reminder, or for anyone who came in late to let you know how it's working here, if you have a question you'd like asked to our panel of speakers, if you could send a direct message to James Egan, you should be able to do that in the chat function. Just send it directly to him. He's going to collect up those questions and pass them on to me, and I will feed them to the speakers as we can. Before we start turning the time over to audience questions, though, I think we want to give the speakers a chance to talk to one another, which will be particularly valuable, I think, because of the diversity in approaches we had. So just a quick recap here. Cherise challenged us to think about what the eternal courts, the eternal justice system might look like, how we can understand the justice system we have here, what are the analogs, how might it be different, how might it be the same. Nathan then talked about the justice concerning legal institutions and the history of Mormon thought surrounding our obligation to obey legal institutions. So we had a nice distinction between the thinking about eternal courts and thinking about the way as a people, the LDS people, have related to and engaged in the law of the land. Ryan then asked a more theoretical question: what can Mormonism contribute to an understanding of justice? And aside from proposing a wonderful sounding TV show, if you're, I guess, into that kind of thing, he suggested that justice as small creates space for learning. So again, this idea that the distinctly LDS engagement with justice is actually partly has to do with the space we create to allow for mistakes and learning and listening to one another, which was really interesting. And now Derek has just explored why it is that there seems to be some tradition of fear and trembling at judgment, and how the Mormon conception of judgment might go some way in correcting this idea that the justice of God is in some sense unjust and terrible to think on. Particularly, we can think that the modern day revelation has given reason to think that we have levels of glory in order to support us in an eternal progression. So that's a lot of stuff. I recapped it partly to give everyone a chance to think and get some questions going. For our speakers, you're all unmuted. Feel free to just speak up. And if you're worried about interrupting, feel free to put your hand up and I can facilitate that way. But otherwise, please, is there someone who wants to make a comment or ask a question? Derek.
Let me start with a question for Nathan. So you've got this view that Mormons have an expressive obligation to obey the law. I'm wondering if you could say more about what it is that grounds such an obligation. The reason I'm worried is that you said that part of its motivation is that it responds to the kind of worry that people have, that Mormons are just going to do whatever God says. And the worry that I have is that without further grounding for such an obligation, it looks like we have a kind of ad hoc response. An ad hoc response is going to be responsive to the questions or the worries, but they're not going to be justified, it seems to me, independently. So I wonder, at one, what grounds the obligation, and two, if we have such an obligation, what would the conditions be under which it might be defeated?
So I think what grounds the expressive obligation would be something like the idea that Latter-day Saints have an obligation to build Zion. And our obligations to build Zion have expressive forms, right? So the most dramatic form of an expressive obligation to build Zion would be the obligation to proclaim the gospel, right? So that's an obligation that's linked to your obligation to build Zion. You've got an expressive obligation to proclaim the gospel as part of your obligation to build Zion. Now, in a sense, I suppose that's an ad hoc obligation in the way that I think you're using it, right? Because I can imagine ways in which Zion could be built without me proclaiming the gospel. Maybe we just all rely on like Ryan doing the gospel proclaiming and I don't do any. Zion might be built without anybody proclaiming the gospel, right? Maybe people get independent revelations and we all coordinate that way. So there is a sort of ad hocery problem, but I would say, right, is that if to the extent we got a grant, it's the ground to build Zion. And the expressive obligation to obey the law is about as ad hoc as something like the expressive obligation to proclaim the gospel, right? It is a way in which we build Zion. In terms of what defeats the obligation, the easy case where the obligation could be defeated is where we're building Zion in a very just legal system, in which because of the justice of the legal system, there is very little danger that the state is going to come after Zion and inhibit the ability of the church to grow. And I actually think you see this in the United States. So you see it with the church's attitude towards illegal immigration. So the church as an institution is sort of like not really all that sussed about illegal immigration. there are members of the church who get really upset about illegal immigrants because they're violating the law, and they think that that violation of the law is some great moral harm. But if you think about the obligation to build the law as an expressive obligation linked to the obligation to build Zion, then it's defeated in a case where you have a just legal system and where the state doesn't constitute a threat to Zion. The really hard case is on the other side, right? Is there a legal regime that is so unjust that there isn't at least some kind of prima facie obligation on the part of Latter-day Saints to obey it? And as a practical matter, the answer in the 20th century has been, it's hard to find one, right? Because Latter-day Saints have been counseled for legal obedience to Nazi Germany, Erich Honecker's East Germany, Pinochet's Chile, like really odious regimes. And Latter-day Saints have been told to obey those laws. What hasn't been told is situations where Latter-day Saints have been counseled to obey laws where the obeying of the law would require them to do something hideously immoral to someone else. So the church has never said, like, you've got an obligation to turn your neighbor into the Stasi or something like that. But I don't think there's there is a good conceptual break on the unjust side, right? Ironically, right, in this argument, right, you've got less of an obligation the more just the legal system gets.
So Nathan, it seems like to me, so you answered my question. I wrote down, can you talk about how you would define a just legal system? And then you talked about how a just legal system would be a system that doesn't constitute a threat to Zion. It seems like, and just correct me if I'm wrong, the legal system would, the outcome of that system would overlap a little bit with, let's see, the outcome of engagement in that system, with the church's engagement in that system, would overlap with the priorities of Zion. So basically, we would either be left to ourselves to do what we want, or there's another alternative, and that would be that the legal system of the state would somehow be kind of controlled by the church. And can you talk a little bit about how that might be just or unjust? I mean, that seems like that system, if you're thinking of a just legal system in terms of Zion only, that might be unjust for others. Who have different priorities.
So I would say, so I don't think it's the case that every legal system that is not a threat to Zion is therefore a just legal system. I think what I said is, if you have a just legal system, it's not going to be a threat to Zion, right? So those are logically different claims. I assume, right, like the American legal system right now, I don't think is a major threat to building Zion, at least directly. It's not super overtly hostile to the church or anything like that. I don't think it's a just legal system. I can think of all sorts of things about the American legal system that are very unjust. Mm-hmm. So I would want to say that I think the relationship there between justice and Zion is complicated. And I'm not actually offering any particular theory, strong theory about justice. About the, like, should the church be in the business of running state? So I think the answer there is probably no. Mm-hmm. There have been times in our history where we've tried to sort of do something like that, right? So Deseret is in the Council of 50 in the Kingdom of God. That looks something like an attempt to kind of create a Mormon state. What's interesting is if you look at the legal institutions they create, they're really weird legal institutions. So there's lots of stuff that they do where they're governing in ways that don't really look at all like law. Which suggests to me is that if you're really serious about trying to build Zion, law is probably not a very effective tool at doing that. And I think the Latter-day Saints' attempts to use law at various times to build Zion have probably not been particularly successful according to theological criteria. So I'm pretty dang like philosophically liberal in that sense. But I don't have a strong, I haven't thought as much about the theory.
Derek, did you want to? Oh, maybe Ryan first, and then Derek. We can get your thoughts. Yeah.
This is a new question. Derek, are you on this?
I had a new question, but it was for Ryan, so Ryan can go first.
Oh, my question, this is mostly for Cherise, also a little for Derek, isn't it weird that we need something like a defense attorney with God? I always feel like those passages of the Doctrine and Covenants are weird, especially given the way that sort of Cherise sort of like is sort of conceiving of God in the heavenly parents kind of way. Isn't that weird? That's all I got.
I guess I'll go first, unless Ryan wants to go first. I'm sorry, not Ryan, Derek.
Go ahead.
Okay. So I think in terms of God being an omniscient judge, that would be true that we would need a defense attorney. I think that where the kind of Christ role comes in terms of kind of a justice system would be where Christ kind of vouches for the person and says, this is the extent to which this person has tapped into, the mercy that or the grace that I'm offering him or her. So I guess it would be, maybe Christ would be providing testimony as kind of the person who says, this is how much mercy, this is how much grace this person has utilized in his or her life. So I think that you're probably onto something, Ryan, where saying that he's filling the role of a defense attorney in terms of an advocate, that might be incorrect, which is why I said at the beginning, I have no answers. This is just something that I have started to think about in my journey, what that system might look like. But yeah, so maybe Christ is more of somebody who provides testimony on behalf of a party rather than a defense attorney. Where the correlation comes in is that term advocate, because an attorney is an advocate. And so it could just be a sloppily used term there. But I do think that that's a really good hunch there that you've got, where, maybe he's not, maybe especially in this system where we've got this omniscient being who's basically, able to know everything about your life and your motivations and the whys behind your actions. And it's interesting because in our system, I've always wondered why we care so much about mitigating evidence at sentencing, right? So you've got the fact finder, which is the jury, and the jury basically it's really interesting. We call them finders of fact, but they also make conclusions of law, which is, a finder of fact would be this person, committed this act, and the conclusion of law, which then the jury checks the box on that jury verdict form. The conclusion of law would be that act constituted murder or constituted some crime of some sort. And so you've got God sitting as both finder of fact and concluder of law, right? But then you've also got in that judgment seat, God being the sentencer. And that's, I think, where Christ comes in and says, here's the mitigating evidence. But God already knows that mitigating evidence, right? So yeah, you're right. That's an interesting conflation of roles there. Derek.
Yeah, I'll just give a quick answer, and then if I may, I'm going to ask Ryan my quick question. My quick answer is first to do a little violence to scripture potentially. And that is in these places in scripture where it talks about Christ being an advocate, it says advocate with the Father. And it's an interesting preposition. It's not advocate to the Father in behalf of, it's an advocate with the Father, which suggest, on my reading, suggests that the Father is also an advocate. I think there's an interesting reading of Moroni 7, where Mormon is giving this sermon about charity. And there's this thing right in the last verse, verse 48. He says this, he says, pray unto the Father with all the energy of heart that ye may be filled with this love, charity, which he hath bestowed upon all who are true followers of his Son, Jesus Christ, that ye may become the sons of God, that when he, I take it Jesus, shall appear, we shall be like him. Why? For we shall see him as he is. And I think one of the distinctive features of God and Christ's love for us is that they see us as we are. And I think part of the advocacy, what I would take as part of the advocacy, is to report to us who we are, because we're blind to who we are. And to say, you actually are loved, you actually are important, you actually are worthy to do a lot more than you think. That doesn't mean you instantly qualify for, the celestial kingdom. I would never defend that kind of view. The consequences matter. But that you might not truly understand who you are. You might come in with a Jonathan Edwards view of yourself and think that you're just a worm to be despised. And I think that what God and Jesus Christ will do is inform you that you are not a worm to be despised. That's my quick answer. Ryan, my question for you is, what does it mean to enforce a law? You said that justice is a part of morality that can be enforced. And I wondered, isn't it the case that if somebody gets to go to the celestial kingdom versus the terrestrial kingdom, that's a kind of enforcement of something? So there is an enforcement of some sort of law that says you get to come into the celestial kingdom now. And so all of justice suddenly gets bigger from your, small notion of justice. You get an instantly bigger notion of justice on the stipulated definition that you gave. So I wondered if you could clarify what enforcement means.
Oh yeah, I'm gonna accept your conceptual move and deny the theological move is what I'm gonna do. So I'm gonna deny that there's enforcement of the boundaries of the celestial kingdom.
Okay. I think actually my view may be more friendly to you. I think our views might be friendly.
Yeah, no, it sounds, I think, yeah, might turn out.
Yeah.
So I had a question for Cherise. The stories, the scriptures and imagery that you were looking at about the sort of divine tribunal above. So one of the things that it strikes up to me as an attorney or a former attorney, right, is it's procedurally really screwed up. Right. So as a lawyer, like you spend a lot of time thinking and worrying about procedural justice, right? Like everybody's got a lawyer and like, do I have access to the evidence? There's an enormous emphasis on procedural justice. And it seems to me is what those images of judge and advocate do is they just scramble the idea of procedural justice, right? Because like the defendant's advocate is also the judge, right? And the defendant's advocate, right, is, or maybe if God the Father's the judge, right, then like my advocate is the judge's son, and I'm a child of the Father. Like it just scrambles the idea of procedural justice, it seems to me. And so one of the if you accept that premise, one thing that it would be really interesting, particularly as a practicing attorney, to think about is, what does it say that there is about the nature of procedural justice that it doesn't seem to be a concern in the divine courts above, whereas it is a huge concern to the courts below, a legitimate concern, obviously, for the courts below. And is there something we can kind of tease out there about the nature of procedural justice, which is a huge question for lawyers and maybe not such a huge question for like real people?
Yeah, no, that's really true. I mean, my job as an appellate attorney is to look back at the process of the trial and to hone in on what procedural injustices have been done. And so that's wholly what we're concerned with on appeal. And we're a lot less concerned with the outcome of the case than we are with what happened below and why. And so I think that what that question kind of gets at is the difference in, I guess, due process that we experience here on earth versus what we are, hoping to experience above. And I think that's why there might be such a different, such different roles that are played. I mean, it might be that there are no prosecutors, no defense attorneys, no judges. I mean, it could be that our concepts and our roles are just completely out of line in the eternal scheme of things. That's something that I am wondering about myself. I know that there are a lot of Mormon thinkers, especially maybe, a while back, who kind of weighed in on this and gave their opinions about what it might look like. I don't know what it might look like, but I think it's interesting to think about the way that God the Father and Christ, as Ryan and Derek have said, are possibly conflated in their roles, and maybe they have nothing to do with judgment. Maybe it's more of both of them play the role of advocate. Maybe we sit in judgment of ourselves. I've heard theories that we have to make it past the bar of Joseph Smith first, because we're part of Joseph Smith's dispensation. Once he clears us, then we, that's maybe one procedural hurdle that we have to go through in order to, make it to Christ. I don't know how comfortable I am thinking about how accurate that might be. That just seems like uncomfortable to me. So, but yeah, maybe the way that we, our justice system is laid out here and the processes that we participate in, maybe it has absolutely nothing to do with the justice system that we engage in above. I love that. I love just like sweeping the table and just saying, you guys look nothing like what we look like, and we're gonna blow your minds when you get here. Come, I love the idea of the justice system above being more about mercy than justice. I just have to wonder what justice even means to a just God.
Thank you, guys. I am going to take the privilege of the fact that I'm allowed to talk and just say too, this has been a really interesting discussion. And when we think about judgment, one way we might think about judgment is less about how we think of judges administering justice in a human context, and maybe more judgment in like an epistemological context. So when we get all the information, we make a judgment about what the truth is. And given what we know in scriptural terms, the way justice is often talked about is being laws where there are consequences to actions. What we might have is a loving father, a loving brother who have the information before them, have a meeting with us where our relationship and evaluation of where we are. I mean, the analogy I thought of right now, my kids are taking swim lessons, and at the end of each lesson, the teacher has to decide, are you up for going into the deeper end or into the more intense swimming in the next level, or should you repeat this level? And that's a very different kind of judgment than I think we typically think of in a court system. Anyway, I'm just throwing that out. We also have a ton of questions from our audience. So I think what I'm going to do is pose these. We're going to see how many we can get through. I'd encourage the speakers, I don't know, we'll try and get through as many as we can of these, okay? There's some really good questions. And a lot of them are really relevant to what we've been saying. So I'm just going to start at the top of the list, actually. One person asked, what is the correlation or lack thereof between justice and justness, right? I'll let you make of that what you will. Does someone want to try and speak to that? Justice versus justness. Justice versus presumably being just, the act of being just.
Let me just throw one quick thought out. It might be that there's a distinction between a kind of property that certain kinds of judgments have, or that people have, a virtue of justness, And then justice might be sort of the structure or framework within which one develops these virtues and makes judgments, as an initial thought.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone else want to say anything about that distinction? Okay, good. Well, let's keep building on that then. So there's a couple questions that are responding to Nate and to the this idea of our the Mormon obligation towards the justice and the laws of the institutions of the states that they find themselves in. So one of these says, a comment re social justice and its potential tension with expressive conception of justice.
So I'd have to know a little bit more about what the question is about. So so social justice, you might say, like, you have an expressive obligation to speak out to make the world more just. And maybe that sort of expressive obligation is also part of the obligation to build Zion or something like that. I think that's right. That seems entirely plausible to me. So then it seems that we could imagine lots of situations in which there would be conflicting expressive obligations, right? You'd have an expressive obligation to, like, speak out to make the world more just, but you'd also have an expressive obligation to speak in such a way as to protect sort of the vulnerable kernel of Zion from attacks of the state. And that might be one way, I think, of understanding the Helmut Hübner case, right? Is that he's sort of caught between these competing conceptions of justice. I don't have any particular theory about how you would resolve those two. I tend to be pretty sympathetic to sort of Aristotelian ideas that when you have sort of conflicting conceptual notions of justice and sort of conflicting conceptual notions of your normative obligations, that the way you resolve those is not always with a sort of better third theory that explains it, but it's sort of a matter of judgment, and you get that by having a sort of experience and good character. And I can dress that up in various Greek words. And I'm not sure if that's like a deep insight about the nature of the human condition or just an intellectual punt.
Thank you. Do any of the other speakers want to add to that? Comment on? I love it when Aristotle gets referenced, so thank you. Well, the next question actually is still, I think, interested in issues surrounding things like social justice. They said, how do the panelists relate what they've said to the concept of equal justice? I'm asking because of Cherise's passing reference to the poorly funded public defender system. It seems to me that the mitigation of poverty in a Zion community might inform us about the concept of equal justice. And I'll add to that, we haven't actually talked a lot about justice as fairness exactly. And I think that's relevant. I'd love to hear what you all have to say about that.
Well, I think this kind of goes back to the discussion surrounding procedure and process. I think when you say that God is a just God and you're looking from this earthly perspective, you're thinking this is a God who engages in the same process for everybody, right? Like nobody is treated differently. And that kind of goes along with this notion that there's an equality, an inherent equality in the heavenly justice system. But at the same time, our justice system, when you say justice system, and you go to a legal conference talking about the justice system, what you're talking about is process. You're not really talking about the outcome. And I have to think that a just God is more because he and she engage in a perfect process, there is a perfect outcome. And so they're very much interested in the outcome rather than the process. The process is part of the equality or the egalitarian nature of perfection, right? So an eternal justice system might look like something that is just absolutely perfect because everybody is treated equally. I can go on and on about different defendants being treated unequally, and my take on the types of people that get reversals in an appellate court versus the types of people that don't get reversals in an appellate court. But I think that that kind of answers that question, or at least attempts to answer that question about how equality might factor into due process, and also into kind of a perfect justice system where the outcome, the process is perfect, and therefore the outcome is also perfect.
A quick thought on that. Both Derek and Ryan are offering sort of a reading of the kind of soteriological idea of justice, right? About how, like, the final judgment and where we go, right? And both of them, it seems to me, are really suggesting is that what we do is we deeply problematize that idea of justice, right? We make it like really small or something like that. It seems to me is that both of them, when they're talking about justice, are actually talking about a particular kind of justice, right? The kind of justice we're talking about is modeled on some kind of retributive justice. The idea there's an act, and then justice requires some kind of punishment for the act. There are other kinds of ideas of justice, right? So there's commutative justice, the idea that I should make recompense to someone else. So Cherise does retributive justice in the criminal justice system. I mostly study civil law, so I'm about commutative justice. And there's also ideas of distributive justice. And what's interesting is that our soteriological stories about heaven and Zion and the rest of it, they tend to deeply problematize retributive justice, but they don't tend to problematize distributive justice.
Thank you.
Can I just throw something in there? I mean, I think that this is a very complicated question, and I think that part of how I was thinking about this question about justice was thinking about kind of the end state sort of notion, which is much more theological. This question really is asking about a kind of very much this worldly sort of justice, and I think Nathan's bringing up some important distinctions that are made in the literature. There's also this distinction that's been alluded to, that there's this kind of like, on one hand, there's a outcome-based kind of account of justice. There's the kind of procedure that, like, things have to check if things are just, we just look at the history of how the procedures went at each step. And then there's this other kind of justice, which just looks at, like, is everybody getting kind of what they deserve or merit or something like that. And, at the end of the day, I have no idea what to think about which of those is the right view in this worldly sense. But what I think in the larger scheme of things, when I'm thinking about our relationship to God, I think that God is aiming to turn us. I have a kind of soul-making view. So God's trying to turn us into a kind of being that's like him. And justice is just us not being put in a place where we're not able to kind of dynamically change and move so that we can become like him. God's not going to stop us so we can't change and become like him. And he's not going to put us somewhere that's not suited to help us to become like him. And so, yeah, I think that this worldly question is a very important one, but I guess I'm just giving some more distinctions to help us think why it's more confusing than we might think.
Well, I'm actually going to suggest that Derek's comment there might have started answering the next question, which was, in a system of eternal increase for everyone in the eternities, what is the necessity of a mortal experience? And I take it that this question maybe moves us a little ways away from justice specifically, but does anyone want to comment on that?
Well, I think that goes along with Andy Baker kind of posted a question to everyone. It seems to me that we are decidedly not treated equally by God. And I think that, correct me if I'm wrong, Andy, but that, who has the same experience in mortality, right? Like, how can we possibly all go through this life having the same experience? The parable of the talents and the pounds factors in. And I think that Derek just kind of spoke to that, where I guess that would be more process. If you're talking about us being treated equally by God, it would be more process oriented rather than outcome oriented, which if you're looking at Derek's focus on the outcome being us being placed in situations where we can become more like God, then conceivably any situation that you're placed in could yield a similar result. And I'll just throw that out to everyone else. Maybe if you want to go back to the original question also, because I kind of conflated the two, borrowed Derek and then kind of spit it back out there, but.
Well, actually, given our time, I'm going to ask one more question. However, we will wrap up, we'll stop recording, and then we will, if people want to hang around and discuss these things in a little more depth, I think probably some of our panelists would love to hear from people posing questions, a little more details on their questions. That might be helpful too for the discussion. So this last one I'm going to finish with is going to bring us back around to, I think, a point of interest that's been recurring here. And this is kind of for Nate and everyone else who's been addressing it. This question says, do you feel that the church's insistence that its members submit themselves to regimes as manifestly unjust as some of the ones you described represents a move away from Doctrine and Covenants 134, which says that all men are bound to sustain and uphold the respective governments in which they reside, while protected in their inherent and inalienable rights by the laws of such governments? Goes on, D&C 134 seems to advocate a more robust, if more complex view of our duty to uphold human laws that requires reflection, discussion, and debate about whether or not a given law or set of laws are themselves just. Have we jettisoned that in favor of something much more simple to apply? Big question. Finish it off in a few minutes. Go ahead, panel.
So I'll say Section 134 is a really interesting document. So like it's the only document that's in the Doctrine and Covenants from Joseph Smith's lifetime that he didn't write and actually or have any interaction with writing it at all. It's basically written by Oliver Cowdery. It's also interesting in that the D&C 134, I think, is a sort of attempt to amalgamate two different strands of thinking about legal obligation. So there's a strand of thinking about legal obligation that comes out of the Protestant Reformation, particularly strongly with Luther, and it's based on the Lutheran exegesis of Romans be submitted to the powers that be. And the idea there is that God instituted government and you have to obey government because government is part of God's order for the universe. And then the other part that's going on there, I think, is something kind of like a Lockean social contract theory. Right, so like you have obligations when you're protecting your rights, and it seems to me is that 134 is kind of incoherent on this, right? That those two things don't sit together really clearly. So I do think it is a much more kind of limited sense of legal obligation if we lean on the Lockean parts of 134. But if we lean on the Lutheran parts of 134, where God is instituted governments, and they're part of God's eternal plan, we sort of sanctify the government and the state, then I think it's sort of a pretty problematic document.
Anyone else want to follow up on that?
I just wanted to ask, Ryan, I think, had a response to the previous question, and I was curious about what he was going to say there.
Oh, sorry. I was basically just going to say I thought it was a good question because it does look like, if you have that view, to take the premise that the kind of thing that goes on post-mortally is similar to the kind of thing that goes on here, then it seems like, well, what was the qualitative difference between those two things? And if the more you undermine that thought, the more you motivate the question, which was why is there some necessity to a mortal existence at all? So I just thought that was an excellent question. I'm open to that question prevailing over the answers.
Well,
Yeah.
Thank you. James, did you want to?
Oh yeah, I was just gonna say, we can wrap it up for the recording, and if any of you want to stick around, we can continue. But obviously, if you gotta go, no hard feelings whatsoever. We really appreciate everybody, especially our participants here, giving of their time and their preparation. The Mormon Scholars in Humanities discussions are going to continue. There's a few coming up, one on music and one on history. We'll send out some announcements about that on our web presence. But for now, let's just thanks everybody, and we can cut the recording.